The incident occurred in the spring of 1945 at a processing facility in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where a transport ship carrying approximately 200 German women prisoners had just docked after crossing the Atlantic from Britain. The women, most of them former Wehrmacht auxiliaries who had been captured during the final weeks of fighting in Europe, had been shackled for the ocean voyage in accordance with British military procedures that treated POW transport as a security operation requiring restraints to prevent escape attempts or violence during the lengthy journey. The shackling was standard practice for POW transports regardless of gender, are applied because regulations specified restraint protocols for moving prisoners in confined spaces where guard-to-prisoner ratios made security difficult, and where any disorder could create genuine danger aboard ship. But the sight that greeted Canadian military personnel when they boarded the ship to take custody of the prisoners was disturbing in ways that regulations and security procedures hadn't anticipated. The women had been shackled continuously for more than a week, had been given minimal opportunity for movement or personal hygiene during the voyage, and showed obvious signs of physical distress and psychological trauma from confinement that went beyond what the voyage's duration alone would have caused. Some had raw wounds where restraints had chafed against skin, and others showed symptoms of deep vein thrombosis from prolonged immobility. Several appeared to be in shock or severe depression, and the general condition of the prisoners suggested treatment that bordered on inhumane, despite technically following authorized procedures for POW transport. The Canadian officer who first encountered these conditions was Major Sarah Morrison, a logistics officer responsible for coordinating prisoner transfers through Halifax, who had processed numerous POW shipments but who had never before dealt with female prisoners arriving in such obviously distressed condition. Morrison's immediate reaction, documented in her subsequent reports and in testimony she gave during the investigation that followed, was shock and anger that women had been transported under conditions that seemed unnecessarily harsh, regardless of security requirements. She made an immediate decision that would become controversial. She ordered the shackles removed from all prisoners before they were transferred to Canadian custody, overriding the British transport commander's objection that regulations required prisoners to remain restrained until they were secured in permanent detention facilities. The moment when Canadian soldiers began removing the shackles from the German women became one of those incidents that challenged everyone's assumptions about how enemies should be treated and about the boundaries between military necessity and basic human dignity. The women's reactions revealed the psychological impact that their treatment had created. Many seemed unable to believe that the restraints were actually being removed, assuming this must be temporary, or that some new form of restraint would replace the shackles. Some began crying uncontrollably, their emotional release suggesting that the removal of physical constraints had triggered the collapse of psychological defenses they had maintained during the voyage. Others remained silent and rigid, watching the Canadian soldiers with expressions that combined fear, confusion, and the beginning of recognition that their circumstances might be changing in fundamental ways. What made the incident particularly powerful was something that one of the Canadian soldiers said while removing restraints from a young German woman who had been shackled so tightly that her wrists were bleeding. The soldier, a corporal named James Sullivan, who would later be interviewed extensively about the incident, looked at the woman and said in halting German that he had learned from his own immigrant parents, "You're not animals. We don't treat people like this in Canada." The statement wasn't officially sanctioned, wasn't part of any prepared remarks about how Canadian forces should address German prisoners, but it captured something essential about the moral revulsion that many Canadian personnel felt when confronting the conditions in which these women had been transported. The German woman to whom Sullivan had spoken reportedly responded with a question that revealed how thoroughly her expectations had been shaped by propaganda and by her recent treatment. "But we are enemies. Why would you treat us as people?" The question, all translated and passed among Canadian personnel at the processing facility, created widespread discomfort because it suggested that the women had internalized narratives about Allied brutality and about their own status as defeated enemies who deserved harsh treatment. Sullivan's response, again translated through the limited German he knew, was simple. "The war is over. You were soldiers. Now you're prisoners. That means we have rules about how to treat you, and those rules say you're people, not animals." The exchange, while perhaps seeming unremarkable when written in official reports, had profound impact on both the German women who witnessed it and on the Canadian personnel who were processing the prisoners. For the German women, the contrast between the shackling they had endured during transport and the Canadian soldiers' matter-of-fact removal of restraints, combined with explicit statements that they would be treated humanely, created cognitive dissonance that many struggled to process. They had expected harsh treatment, had been prepared for conditions that reflected their status as defeated enemies of nations they had fought against, and the Canadian approach of removing restraints while explaining that prisoners had rights that would be respected didn't fit the framework through which they understood their situation. For the Canadian personnel, the incident forced confrontation with questions about what military necessity actually required and about whether Allied forces were maintaining moral standards that distinguished them from the regimes they had fought against. The shackling of prisoners during transport might have been justified by security concerns, but seeing the physical and psychological damage it had caused, particularly to women who posed minimal actual security threat, made many Canadian soldiers and officers question whether regulations should be followed when they produced results that seemed to contradict the values Allied forces claimed to represent. Major Morrison's decision to remove restraints, despite objections from British transport authorities, reflected this tension between following procedures and responding to humanitarian concerns that procedures hadn't adequately addressed. The controversy that followed the incident revealed different perspectives about how POW treatment should balance security requirements against human dignity. British military authorities who had overseen the transport argued that Morrison had exceeded her authority by ordering restraints removed before prisoners were secured in permanent facilities, that her decision had created unnecessary security risks, and that emotional responses to prisoners' distress shouldn't override established procedures that existed for good reasons. And they pointed out that German forces had committed terrible atrocities during the war, that some female auxiliaries had been complicit in those atrocities, and that treating enemy prisoners gently sent wrong messages about accountability for wartime conduct. Canadian authorities, while acknowledging that Morrison had technically violated protocols by removing restraints without authorization, largely supported her decision and used the incident to advocate for revised procedures for transporting female POWs that would account for gender-specific needs and vulnerabilities. They argued that maintaining moral high ground required treating prisoners humanely even when regulations might permit harsher treatment, that the women who had been shackled were auxiliaries who had performed non-combat roles and who posed minimal security threat, and that subjecting them to restraints that caused physical injury was neither necessary nor consistent with Canadian values or with Geneva Convention principles. The German women themselves, as they processed through Halifax and were transferred to POW camps in Alberta and Ontario, carried memories of the incident that influenced how they perceived their Canadian captivity. Many would later describe the removal of shackles and Sullivan's statement, "You're not animals," as the moment when they began to understand that their captivity might be fundamentally different from what they had been led to expect. The contrast between British transport procedures and Canadian reception created a specific impression that while both were allied nations, they had different approaches to prisoner treatment, and that Canadian authorities were genuinely committed to maintaining standards of humane treatment even for enemy prisoners. This perception was reinforced by subsequent treatment in Canadian POW camps, where female prisoners were housed in facilities that provided adequate living conditions, medical care, educational programs, and work opportunities that paid minimal wages. The camps weren't comfortable. They were still detention facilities with restricted freedom and constant reminder of prisoner status. But they operated within Geneva Convention frameworks, and Canadian authorities made genuine efforts to ensure that prisoners were treated as human beings whose basic needs and dignity were respected. For women who had expected brutal treatment based on Nazi propaganda and on their transport experience, this approach created another layer of cognitive dissonance that forced reconsideration of what they had been taught about Allied nations and about the war's moral dimensions. Sullivan's statement that "we don't treat people like this in Canada" became something of an unofficial motto among Canadian personnel working with female POWs, referenced in training materials and in discussions about how Canadian values should shape prisoner treatment policies. It wasn't that Canada had perfect record in prisoner treatment. There were incidents of misconduct and abuse. There were camps where conditions were inadequate. There were individual Canadian soldiers who behaved inappropriately toward prisoners. But the general approach, exemplified by Morrison's decision and Sullivan's articulation of principle, emphasized that maintaining moral standards required treating prisoners humanely regardless of what enemy forces had done or what military regulations might technically permit. The broader significance of the incident lay in what it revealed about the complicated ethics of captivity and about how small moments of human decency could challenge dehumanization that warfare encouraged. The German women had been reduced to security problems requiring restraint, processed through procedures that treated them as dangerous cargo rather than as human beings. The Canadian response, removing restraints, acknowledging prisoners' humanity, explaining that rules protected their dignity, didn't erase the fact of captivity or change the power dynamics that made the women completely dependent on their captors. But it did establish that even within the coercive framework of POW detention, there were limits to how prisoners could be treated and expectations that they would be seen as people rather than as objects or animals. For some of the German women, this experience planted seeds of understanding about the differences between the regime they had served and the democratic societies they had fought against. The Nazi state had been built on dehumanization of enemies and on the conviction that might made right, that defeated enemies deserved no consideration and that showing mercy was weakness. The Canadian approach suggested a different framework, that even enemies retained human dignity, that military victory didn't eliminate moral obligations to treat defeated opponents humanely, and that maintaining ethical standards even in war's aftermath was possible and important. Whether this lesson influenced the women's post-war attitudes and behaviors remained difficult to assess, but at minimum, it provided a concrete experience that contradicted propaganda they had been exposed to, and that demonstrated that Allied values had some relationship to Allied conduct. The physical and psychological recovery of the women who had been shackled during transport took weeks or months depending on the severity of their injuries and trauma. The medical reports documented deep tissue damage from restraints, symptoms of post-traumatic stress from confinement, and general debilitation from voyage conditions that had been within technical compliance with regulations but that had caused serious harm. Canadian medical personnel treating these injuries expressed frustration that procedures had permitted such treatment and advocated for immediate revision of transport protocols to prevent similar incidents. The advocacy was successful. Canadian authorities implemented new guidelines for female POW transport that specifically prohibited prolonged shackling, required regular opportunities for movement and hygiene, and mandated medical monitoring during voyages. The incident became part of the historical record about Canadian POW policy and about the specific challenges of handling female prisoners during and after World War II. It was referenced in subsequent policy debates about prisoner treatment, cited as example of why regulations needed to account for specific circumstances rather than applying identical procedures regardless of context, and used to train personnel about the importance of maintaining humanitarian standards even when dealing with enemy prisoners. The women involved, while remaining prisoners until repatriation, had their experience shaped by that initial encounter in Halifax, where Canadian soldiers had removed their shackles and told them they were people, not animals, a message that challenged both their expectations about captivity and their understanding of the nations they had fought against.